All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books Presents Online, New Hampshire Public Radio's Civics 101 co-host, Nick Capodice. I really am so sorry about butchering that. I have it written down even. And Hannah McCarthy, who will discuss their new book, A User's Guide to Democracy, How America Works, in conversation with Gabe Fleischer from St. Louis NPR's Wake Up to Politics. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore, celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Nick, Hannah, and Gabe, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are still bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books, with curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are incredibly happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. And this is one of those books that definitely can make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Nick and Hannah and Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy from you and for all of your friends at left-bank.com. It is a really fantastic book with lots of really incredible photos or illustrations in there as well. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times, and we thank you ahead of time for your support to help us keep this event series going. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so be sure to type those up as a comment, and we will get to those. You can type those up at any point in time. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And I'm going to try not to butcher this again. From Nick Capodice and Hannah McCarthy, the hosts of New Hampshire Public Radio's Civics 101, and New Yorker cartoonist Tom Toro, A User's Guide to Democracy is a lively crash course in everything you should know about how the U.S. government works. Do you know what the Secretary of Defense does all day? Are you sure you know the difference between the House and the Senate? Have you been pretending you know what federalism is for the last 20 years? Don't worry, you're not alone. The American government and its processes can be dizzyingly complex and obscure, until now. Within this book are the keys to knowing what you're talking about when you argue politics with the uncle you only see at Thanksgiving. It's the book that sits on your desk for quick reference when the nightly news boggles your mind. This approachable and informative guide gives you the lowdown on everything from the three branches of government to what you can actually do to make your vote count, to how our founding documents affect our daily lives. Now is the time to finally understand who does what, how they do it, and the best way to get them to listen to you. Publishers Weekly says it is an informative and appealing civics lesson for first-time voters and old hands alike. And Kirkus Reviews says, an easily digestible, illustrated guidebook to the agencies and institutions that make up the federal government. Just the thing for students of civics, which these days should be the entire polity. Nick Capodice is the co-host of Civics 101. Before coming to NHPR, Nick worked in the education department at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, where he wrote and led tours, trained educators, and helped design digital exhibits. He also led beer history and tasting tours for Urban Oyster in Brooklyn. And Hannah McCarthy is the co-host of Civics 101 from New Hampshire Public Radio. She came to New Hampshire by way of Brooklyn, where she worked as a radio producer and writer, and she lives in Boston, Massachusetts. Tonight, Nick and Hannah will be in conversation with Gabe Fleischer. Gabe Fleischer is the author of Wake Up to Politics, a daily political newsletter with nearly 50,000 subscribers, and host to the accompanying podcast produced by St. Louis Public Radio. Gabe has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and other news outlets, and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. He is currently a freshman at Georgetown University studying government and journalism. And now I am so happy and pleased to welcome Nick Capodice and Hannah McCarthy and Gabe Fleischer for Left Bank Books. If everyone at home would please give them a very hearty round of applause, welcoming them to the screen. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Nick, I am so sorry.
Oh, it's fine. When I walked to graduation in college, he said "Cap il Duce," and it was terrifying.
Oh man,
it's okay. You're
You
in
don't
fine
want that.
company. Yeah, you don't want that.
All right, well, have fun, and I will see you all in a little bit.
Great.
All right,
Shane?
thanks, Shane.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I was so excited to be talking with both you, Hannah and Nick. I'm a huge fan, as I was saying before, of Civics 101, and it's been a huge motivation for me as I've been doing my own podcast. So I just want to say that, and I want to kind of start there with kind of what was the inspiration for you in terms of what made you guys think that America needed kind of a crash course in civics, a user's guide, kind of in the podcast and kind of with writing the book.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was gonna say, but I'll tell the story of the. Well, you tell the story of the podcast, and I'll tell the story of the book.
That sounds great. So the podcast came about shortly after the 2016 election. The station, New Hampshire Public Radio, was getting a lot of questions from listeners along the lines of, can that person do what they just did? Is that legal? And by the way, I'm hearing about the Secretary of Defense a lot in the news, but what does the Secretary of Defense do? And it was a lot of questions about the very simplest level of democracy, right? Not the complex analysis, just like, who are these people and what are they doing? Which I think a lot of people started to pay attention to about 4 years ago. So a producer, Logan Shannon, at the station, wrote on a Post-it note, and the reason I love this is because it reminds me of the Bartlett for President moment in West Wing. If you're a West Wing fan, that's a napkin, I think. Wrote on the Post-it note, Schoolhouse Rock for adults. That's what we need. We need Schoolhouse Rock for adults, because who can remember civics if they took a civics class to begin with? And it started just as this direct interview show where it's one expert and one host. There was a prior host before us, just answering those very basic questions with like one subject: Secretary of Defense, the executive, Congress, the three branches of government, etc. And the nice thing about making a podcast about government is that you have endless episode options. We will never run out of ideas, and it's not that hard to pitch an episode. So that's how we got here. Nick and I took over about 2 years ago.
I think about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we started, the show went from being that straight interview show to being a more heavily produced show with multiple experts, because our hope was to really story tell so that these lessons about civics would stick in people's minds. That's the podcast.
Yeah, and what's great is that more and more students in schools across America are listening to it, especially in the time of COVID. I have a kid who's staring at a screen a great deal in the new remote learning, and to just have an excuse to have something to put in your ears versus to just have something to stare at is quite lovely. The book it's delightful to me because when I started working at Civics 101, I was working not as a host, but as an education outreach producer. And before my first day on the job, I was like, I need like a book that's just kind of got the primer of everything, just sort of like the nuts and bolts of everything. I don't care how big it is. I just want to get through it. And I couldn't find it. And when Hannah and I were approached with Tom Toro to write this book, we're like, this is what we need to make, this thing that touches as much as humanly possible to as wide an audience as possible. It's not written for kids. It's not written for adults, but we feel like as many people in a huge range of ages can read it and have a good time and learn about it.
To me, when I was reading the book, and you guys do a great job of kind of like just laying out, like you're saying, kind of just those basic facts. And to me, before we started this, I was doing some research. It was kind of like some of the stats of kind of like the civics education scores we have. And to be honest, it's kind of depressing to see, like about 60% of people can't name all three branches of government, stuff like that. And you have all that kind of information in the book. And I'm curious, because I know you talked to a lot of teachers and educators when you're researching the show and the book. Like, how do you think we got here, and how do you think we got to this situation where people need like this user's guide, just need all this laid out for them?
Yeah, well, like you don't, right? And I dare say, I'm gonna be going on a limb here, that your generation, is successively not needing the book maybe as much as people my age, 40, or maybe people in their 30s up to their 60s and 70s. I personally didn't have the strongest civics education as a kid. I mean, I had it in 8th grade and then it was done. How can you expect something that's just taught this one time? Another reason that I think we might have gone a bit on the wayside in terms of civics, and it's just a dramatic reduction in funding for social studies and civics and humanities across the United States in favor of things that are great, like STEM is great. But if we don't know our government and the story of our country, which I was taught, frankly, an inaccurate story of our country and the systems that created it, then you're going to get to a lot of trouble, like the trouble we're kind of in right now in terms of one of the most partisan moments, perhaps since the Civil War. That's my thoughts on that. Hannah, did you have anything you want?
I think too, there's just quite a bit to be said about, for those who were taught civics, how it was taught, because I think about my mother reminiscing about the civics classes that she took many, many years ago in Massachusetts. And she just remembers it as being the most dull, tooth-grindingly dull presentation about government. And I think without an infusion of stories about the personalities and the reason that these systems were developed and how they impact you directly. If you can't see yourself in the story of the United States, we can look at this two ways. If you can't see yourself because it's bad storytelling, or if you can't see yourself because you're only being told stories that have nothing to do with you, then I think it's really hard to meaningfully engage and really root that understanding in your mind and then apply it.
It's interesting, Nick, you brought up kind of like the state of obviously like very deep divided partisanship we have right now. And I think a lot of people would look at our political state right now and see a lot to kind of criticize. Do you think that a line can be drawn from kind of that kind of state of civic education we're talking about, that a lot of adults don't know these kind of basic nuts and bolts things? Did you think that kind of our partisanship and kind of chaotic system like is a direct kind of result of that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's part of it entirely. It's also, there's a lot of gatekeeping going on, Gabe. I think there's a lot of people who are afraid to ask these basic questions. I certainly was. Like, I wouldn't be at a bar or at a coffee house and be like, can you just tell me what the Secretary of State does actually do? Because I would be too embarrassed to do that. I know people who walk by the State House and say, what are they doing there? We're in Concord, New Hampshire. Like, what are they doing all day? And that's like, okay. But I think it's both people who are in the know take steps to stay in the know. People who are in power take steps to stay in power. And we're at a time when maybe questioning things is not cool and you just don't want to do it. So I think that's maybe the bigger thing, which is an unwillingness to have to be able to ask those simple questions.
I would say, too, that you pointed out the fact that Gabe certainly does know what he's talking about when it comes to civics and government. I think that if we have, by any number of events and machinations, been lured into a little bit of a complacency, which then leads those in power to be able to do whatever they want. I mean, as we learned producing this show and writing this book, the president can do whatever the president wants until someone says something. That's the answer to that question. But I think that the younger generations they have a lot of energy and they're paying attention, and they are, I think, going to prove that, in fact, when the people speak up and get involved and run for office, then what feels chaotic and out of control can start to be reeled back in with this infusion of new ideas and more thoughtfulness.
Like, that's kind of interesting to me because like I often run into that kind of stereotype that it's young people that don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to politics, or that they're very disengaged. And it sounds like both of you really find the opposite, and that this book, you don't see it as being for kids. Like you think adults need to know about this. Like we'll talk about that dynamic a little bit of that you think really maybe it's the older generations that kind of need the help here.
So one of the great joys of working on our show is not just making the show, which is the greatest joy, right? Hannah and I get to call experts and ask smart people, way smarter than us, the answers to these simple questions, and they lay it out brilliantly. But the other joy is we get to travel to schools across the country. We get to go into the classrooms, teach them how to make podcasts, teach them a little fun audio production skills. And I have seen without exception a level of engagement with the political process in that generation. I'm talking 8th grade to senior year in high school that I've never seen. And I think your point about, the youth are disengaged leads me to another thing that Hannah and I talk about an awful lot, which is the youth vote. and the importance of the youth vote. And if a certain demographic does not vote as much, then the people in power have less interest in appealing to that demographic. And then the stereotype perpetuates itself of disengagement.
Yeah, this is my favorite. This is a little bit off topic, but that's my favorite argument for voting. When you're telling someone, and I have one of my dearest friends in the world has insisted to me for a very long time that her vote doesn't matter because she's voting in Massachusetts and it's a blue state and she's going to vote blue. But I just love that argument that you are adding to the numbers of your demographic. She would be adding to the numbers of like first generation people living south of Boston under the age of 35, right? So it's just like, fine, don't care about your vote, but do increase your demographic. And I don't know exactly why that is, Nick, that it does seem that the youth is very engaged, but I think that that's often happened. There have always been moments in history where the youth is engaged, and we are just in one of these upswings, I think.
Yeah, that's what. So Mary Beth Tinker is one of my personal heroes. She's one of the parties in Tinker v. Des Moines, the landmark Supreme Court case, which said that students have a right to expression and speech once they've crossed that threshold into the schoolhouse gate. And one of my favorite quotes of hers is that kids, more than anyone, have a really good eye for knowing what's not fair. Like, and I know this, like from a 2-year-old, and if it's a 4-year-old, it's like, this is not fair, and this can't happen. We as jaded old adults, we're used to things not being fair, and life ain't fair, kid. But students and the youth have always, throughout history, been the ones to point out unfairness and power grabbing more power. So, you're continuing that strong tradition. So are the 8th graders today as well.
And I think in terms, go ahead, Gabe, please.
No.
Well, you asked why then adults? Why should adults pick up this book? And I do think it's a little bit, perhaps, Nick, of that jadedness. And I think either you follow a life in politics, and we, especially people who work in New Hampshire, see a lot of people very much engaged in politics. We have a massive legislature, the third largest in the world.
424. Yeah, it's massive.
Yeah, any number of people can become rep in this state. That's a complicated question too. But I think that for the most part, if you're not already engaged in those politics, you might be moved to complain about the potholes in your town or complain about education. But I think the disconnect there, and the reason why it would be great for adults to buy this book, is that complain about it, great, and then go to your town hall for a bill hearing, go testify, write your legislature. It makes a difference. And I think that we can sort of forget that we have any say in the way that our world is working, when just fall into that pattern of complaining. But in actual fact, you are in some ways in charge and can have an effect on your state and local operations.
Yeah, because I think, I completely agree that I think especially young people, but all people right now, we're seeing kind of record high levels of political engagement, whether that's protests or, writing Congress people, all that. But it's still true the kind of voter turnout, especially among young people and among all generations, remains pretty low. And I'm curious if both of you think, what role civics education has in that, because I love kind of the end of the book is all about, okay, now we've given you all this information, but here's the how-to. Like now, what do you talk about how to vote, how to write your congressman? Do you think that's kind of maybe the missing piece here? It's not like engagement politics; it's just people don't know what to do with it.
I think that's certainly part of it. It feels so totally obscure or obtuse, rather, to me, and it actually did until I started hosting this show and researching for this book. There's a total disconnect. Even that people say to you, write your legislator, but how? And where does that letter actually go? And if I call them, is anyone actually going to answer? And if I leave a voicemail, does it just fall into the ether? So I do think there's something to be said. How many people actually get taught, what happens when you call your senator or your rep? How many people actually know the steps for running for local office, which are far fewer and more accessible than higher offices because we concentrate so much on the big, sexy elections and we don't pay any attention to the local elections. And so people who've been running for, sheriff for 15 years are still sheriff because you're just seeing that name and checking that box. So I think that it is that twofold thing. Like the lack of engagement is because of the lack of education and vice versa. Do you want to add to that, Nick?
I think that's pretty great. We use any excuse to talk about the importance of understanding how your state-specific government works. Mm-hmm. When we're thinking about primaries and caucuses and early voting and, can you mail it in your state? Just these basic things are so completely different. There are 50. We live in a country of 50 different governments. Hannah wrote the chapter in our book on federalism. Good work, Hannah. I'm so glad you took it.
Favorite subject.
But we live in a federalist government, and it's just there are 50 different governments running everything from school to every little thing that touches your life is probably local government, and yet we put all of our time and energy thinking about the big presidential. I'm not saying, I do too. I love presidential elections. I could talk about the Electoral College forever. Like I love those fascinating systems, but it really is the state and local and looking at what like ballot measures and initiatives, things like that are where your democracy really counts.
And do you think that's a failing of like media, of people like us, like putting too much coverage on those races? Do you think that's in schools? Like what do you think? How do we get there to the point where there's that so much focus away from where the actual governing is happening in some cases?
I wouldn't want to blame just the media, partly because we were in the media, right? We work in public media. As we talked about in the book, the notion of even like red and blue is so gosh darn new. Like it's so new. It wasn't until Bush v. Gore that we really started calling things red states and blue states. That did not happen before. So I feel like symbolism has joined with that to sort of create a more sort of partisan society. And the media certainly, when I was a kid, it wasn't 24 hours. And when you were younger, it was. And you live in 24 hours, Gabe. Every day you put that newsletter out. I don't know really. Hannah, what do you got? What's to blame? Is anything else to blame for this?
Well,
is it us?
It's the internet. It's the death of the small town newspaper. I actually do think that there are still, I'm sorry. It is not a one-to-one. This is not the only reason, right, that we're not paying as much attention to the local stuff. But so, I've been in communities where the local newspaper is still quite robust. And I do see a difference in the conversations that people have around the breakfast table when it comes to what is happening, when it comes to who actually shows up to committee hearings, to who actually signs what petition or calls to complain. I think it's actually harder to get stuff done in those communities because the community is watching you like a hawk. And then you just have fewer and fewer of those local newspapers. And I can't solve the death of the newspaper. Certainly. I don't know what to say about that. And then it's the infusion of money. Like at the federal level, when it comes to elections there are millions and millions and millions of dollars swirling around, which can make things big and flashy and attention grabbing. And you've got brilliant people who know how to write the right headlines and get the right press people to cover the right stuff. You just don't have that much money at the local level, so it is, I think, it's money and media. Yeah.
I'm curious, is there something in the book that you guys were surprised by? Was there a big question that you had that you really wanted to learn, or something that you were kind of struck by when you were researching the book?
Oh, yeah.
A lot.
A lot of every single chapter.
I know.
The first chapter is about the first article. It's about Congress. It's about the difference between the House and the Senate and what they do all day. That such a minuscule amount of legislation actually makes it through, even to the president's desk, to be signed or vetoed. That of all the bills proposed, often somewhere around 3% actually become laws. And of those that do become laws, the majority of those are what we would think of as rather non-controversial. These are not things like a giant COVID relief bill. These are things like, shall we name this statue or this room that after this person instead of this person. It's that sort of legislation really is the majority of it. I was quite surprised by that. I was also surprised by the lovely path of how a case rises to the Supreme Court, because I love the Supreme Court, but to actually research and study the step-by-step before you get to that lovely writ of certiorari, and how many of those that the Supreme Court gets every year, and how few cases they take. They take about 60 cases of every 8,000 petitions for writ of certiorari. Those are the two things that sort of most surprised me doing research. Hannah, you go next, though. I've been talking to you.
Yeah. Oh, no. I mean, I'll share what I shared on the radio earlier today, which is in researching anti-canon cases, which are cases that the Supreme Court has ruled on and then changed their mind about, has gone back and said, whoa, that was a really bad ruling. And it was not constitutional, or the Constitution has changed since and it's no longer pertinent. But the fact that this noble, it seems to be carved in stone institution of all of the institutions, right? Like the Supreme Court in particular, and you feel like there are these, this is my perception of the Supreme Court, these weighty minds who deliberate and actually talk to one another, and listen to various opinions, that they can decide what the Constitution means and then say, whoops, was really fascinating to me. And I also find it interesting that the Supreme Court does that, but you don't really see the legislature doing that in too explicit a way, or the executive branch doing that in too explicit a way. With the legislature and the executive, it's move forward, build upon, don't really talk about the mistakes. But the Supreme Court has to. So that was just, and then presidential precedent is just baffling to me, because the powers enumerated in the Constitution are rather few, and the president behaves and can do what the president does because of all who have preceded, right? So like every president who makes a grand sweeping decision, like for example, only 2 terms, it's just going to be 2 terms, until until Congress finally had to make that part of the rules, right? But like the president defines the presidency is basically what I found. It just really kind of terrifying and fascinating, and really a strong argument for why we need to pay attention to what the executive is doing, because Congress can always, raise a hand and say, I don't know, the Supreme Court can always rule something unconstitutional. So.
I also didn't know that Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with woolly mammoths until we started. Obsessed.
I didn't know that Teddy Roosevelt took this crazy trip on a river in the Amazon, which they renamed the River Roosevelt. And he would have run for president again, except he came back having been weakened and infected on this trip, and he forced his son Kermit to come along, and he died before he could run for re-election because the man was wild and had to go on this crazy trip to get his willies out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the very last sort of an appendix to the book is Hails to the Chief, where Hannah and I found fun little tidbits about each of the presidents thus far. And that was it was great to step away from 347 pages of just this is this system and this system, this is a breeze, you're going to get this, and here's a fun cartoon, to all right, let's goof around and talk about how Franklin Pierce got a Christmas tree in the White House and Jimmy Carter was the first president born in a hospital. We like those sorts of things as well. We got the excuse to jump in and do those.
Did you have any other favorite? That's one of the books. It's a lot of fun too. There's a lot of fun sidebars and any other kind of fun anecdotes that you were really happy you were able to slip in.
We cut our foot down. We cut our foot. We had literally 3 times the amount of foot.
Yeah.
Very generous.
The publisher was so kind. But do you have to talk about them? I guess not. I'm trying to think. What are your favorites, Nick?
Oh, in terms of the footnotes, we had a long, fun footnote on senatorial courtesy. Are you familiar, Gabe, with senatorial courtesy, which is the notion of, which is just sort of an unsung thing that happens. By the way, anyone out there who doesn't know senatorial courtesy, that when the Senate is advising, consenting on an appointment from the president to a position, if a single one of the senators from the state where that new person coming to the position says no, then the vote is dead in the water. And it's not written anywhere. It's just a fun little, because it's assumed that senator is going to know this new person for the position, and they can just say, no, we're not going to take this appointment to this cabinet or something like that. But the fun story about how it happened, this one dude, Benjamin Fishburne, and George Washington getting all mad and coming in and being like, hey, why did you guys say no to my pick for, the commissioner of ports or some small job like that? So that's like one example of several thousand. We had to cut, but we kept a couple fun ones because you got to have the fun little side notes because you're going to want to be thumbing through this thing. You can read it through all at once, or you're going to be thumbing through it and referring to it. You got to have some fun stuff in there too.
Yeah, the Kennedy-Nixon debate fact.
Oh yeah.
So it is possibly fallacy that Kennedy won because he looked better, right? So there's this prevailing notion that you had Kennedy and Nixon in a televised debate, which was a really big deal, and that Kennedy is glowing and well rested and so handsome, and he's not sweating at all, and isn't he charming? And then Nixon had just had surgery, and he had 5 o'clock shadow, and he was a little bit sweaty and not well rested at all. And there was this idea that Kennedy won because he just looked better, but in fact, most Americans didn't comment on that at all. I think there was like one newspaper article that even mentioned the way that the two men looked. And for the most part, radio listeners thought that Nixon won. So it's just, or favored him rather in the debate. So I just thought that was really interesting. This happens to us all the time reporting the show as well. Our prevailing myths about America are just dashed to pieces. And sometimes it's always good, right? And sometimes it's really, really great. And sometimes it's really upsetting. But we're the better for it.
Well, that's actually, that kind of brings up an interesting question because you were talking earlier also about like how much power the president has. And then Nick, you talk about kind of how much power like one individual senator can have through kind of the blue slip process through senatorial courtesy. And like, I wonder like if you read the book and if you like kind of arm yourself with all this information, which we agree is good, but do you think it's comforting, or does it lead to kind of even more questions or more kind of like, how is that really part of our system? Like how do you think people will kind of walk away from the book? Will they feel better about the system or maybe like more motivated to kind of make changes or to change it?
I think specifically, Gabe, when we're thinking about like exploring our foundational documents, right? Like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, even a little whiff for the Articles of Confederation, and then, the Bill of Rights and the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers. I think you're going to be the better off for it, right? But the thing is, your point is making me stop being a cynic and more of a skeptic, and I'm trying to not be so down about it. Yes, it will be frustrating to learn about some of the systems of power and how things work. But there's no way you can change anything without just that basic knowledge. Like you just need to have the knowledge. If you consider it a beast, an enemy, or a friend, however you consider the system, there's nothing that can be done to change it if you don't have an understanding of the absolute basics and why it was made the way it was, why our country was created the way it was. And it's always changing, my feelings on things like our foundational documents. We just did an episode where we revisited the Declaration of Independence from the marginalized communities who were not included in it. And there was one guest I had who said, just flat out, it is a shame that people read the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. And I was like, that's not how I feel, but I got to hear his point. And I thought it was a very powerful point and a very powerful argument. And so the more you learn about these things that are hallowed and cherished in sort of a non-threatening way, the more power you have to get stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
I would say too, it's not in learning about these hallowed things, what you uncover are these beautiful philosophical principles that are absolutely essential to the way that our nation has developed. It's just that they've either not been upheld, or they've only been upheld for a certain sect of the population, or they have been mistreated and messed around with. But I think something else that I got out of those Declaration Revisited episodes that Nick produced is that you, by and large, had individuals saying, we have taken these great principles and kind of not upheld them. But the fact that they are there and we can look at that as our foundation and attempt to get there, not that we're coming from it, but that we're working toward it. I think that is the infusion of optimism that I always come to at the end of sometimes quite dashing moments of research that, okay, but that principle is still there, right? This was a nation ostensibly built for the people. So let's make it for the people by knowing how it works. Yeah.
Are there any other takeaways that you hope people, don't read the book without missing, that you hope that kind of that you think are most important for readers to kind of be thinking about it and to remember as they read the book and after, especially heading into the election year?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, you go first.
I would say, and we already talked about this a little bit, but even I glazed over a little bit when I was writing about state and local government, but it is so absolutely essential to your life. And you can have the sort of disillusionment add to your demographic argument for voting, or you can say, yes, you're voting for the president and maybe you feel like your vote doesn't matter, and maybe your vote doesn't, depending on where you are, you might not change the world there. However, you can vote for any number of state and local offices that are not only governing your life year to year to year, they are also determining how voting works in your state or town, right? And if they are determining how voting works, they determine the systems of voting, which either make you feel empowered or disempowered. If you want that to change, if in the next election you're not feeling so hot about this one, but you want to feel better and more empowered in the next one, pay attention to those state and local offices and make sure you vote for the person who's going to forward your desires when it comes to voting. And I say vote either way. I don't care who you vote for. Go and vote. But this is why it's important to vote no matter what, because those state and local offices make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good one. I think I would say if there was one thing that you sort of took away from reading it, maybe something that you're not familiar with that you maybe should know, is sort of the rundown of the 10 plus the anti-canon Supreme Court cases. Because, Marbury versus Madison is a horrific court case to read when you read the opinion of Marbury. Have you read the opinion of Marbury?
I can't say that I have.
Oh, you're a better man for it. All right, don't any social studies teacher who's here that heard me say that, please ignore I said that. A lot of these Supreme Court cases are really tough to read, but then as you get into the 1950s and 60s, when we start to see real, actual, cool decisions that are increasing our freedoms and liberties, it wasn't until the 1920s that there was a court case that was about the First Amendment, somebody's right to do something is free speech. We think that we hold the 1 through 10, the Bill of Rights, is to be the most important thing that makes America America. We are free and we have the freedom of speech. But the Supreme Court wasn't weighing on that stuff until the 20s. There've pretty much been 2 Supreme Court cases that have expanded our liberties when it comes to something like protest. Tinker v. Des Moines and Texas v. Johnson. It's 2 times. So it's, even though these are the things we care most about when it comes to our interpretation of the Constitution, it really wasn't in the public eye until the 1920s, until after World War I, that this started to happen. That's something I think you could take away.
Well, you talk in the book, because I honestly, I know what Marbury versus Madison is, but I can't say that I have read the opinion. But you talk in the book about kind of the importance of reading those primary documents, of going back to what does the Constitution actually say, reading not just a summary of it, and you guys do a great job of kind of summarizing, giving people the most important points. But why do you think that is that people should? What do you think people gain from going back to the actual kind of primary documents themselves, like you say in the book?
Well, I feel terrible for just outing Marbury versus Madison as being a very difficult opinion for me to read.
John gives you.
It is. Okay, cool. Great. Thank you. So the importance of reading those primary source documents, specifically the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Byzantine Federalist Papers, what we now call the Federalist Papers, those 85 essays by Madison, Jay, and Hamilton. If you do that, you're unbeatable. Like if you manage to do this, there is nothing that can stand in your way because you have a knowledge of this document, which can at times be tough to read. They can at times be Byzantine, and they can make your eyelids droop a little bit. But if you read them first, then read an analysis of them or summary of them, and then go back and read them again, and then read some political commentary on them, you're going to be unbeatable. It's your armor to defending your beliefs in this country. Shane,
hello.
How are you, Shane?
From the ether, I appear. I'm great. This has been a really incredible conversation, and I consider myself to be fairly well versed in politics, and nope, not even close to you. So thank you so much for illuminating so many different subjects in such a very understandable way, all of you. So I think that the audience also is just reveling in this conversation. So I wanted to get to some of their questions if you would like to segue into that. So we're going to start and also audience, if you do have any questions, be sure to type those up as a comment and we will get to those in a moment. So we're going to start with a question from Barbara. Barbara says, I have a question on the Electoral College impact on the 2020 election. There will be a larger percent of votes by mail, and those votes won't be counted until after in-person voters vote. Doesn't that mean that the electoral voters won't necessarily have clarity on their state's final votes and how those will pan out by November 3rd or 4th? When will we know the actual tally of electoral votes, do you think?
Well, Gabe will know the real answer. But in terms of, I think so this is a complicated question because it's not just exploring the system of the Electoral College, but how will mail-in voting specifically change things. I think one thing we really have to watch out for is how we, the media, cover those results coming in by mail-in ballots and to not succumb to our deep desire to declare a winner. This will happen. Good God, this will happen. What is it? The first Monday in December, the first Monday after the first Tuesday in December is when the electors get together and at their local state legislature to vote in the actual president. I don't know how long it will take to tally those mail-in votes, but I do want to point out that we should all be aware of the recent Supreme Court decision that came out about the Electoral College, which is the Electoral College was created as sort of a bulwark between the people and the vote for the president, and at the time a very manly group of men who were full of virtue and could see the virtue in others and could stop a tyrant who was a total appealer to the people, a populist, from being elected.
A demagogue.
A demagogue. Thank you, Hannah. Because these men of virtue would see the virtue and the lack of virtue in that man and stop him from being president. And that is what we call a faithless elector, somebody who does vote in December, not for the person who won the plurality of your votes in your state. It is now legal for every state to make a law forbidding faithless electors to vote for whom they think should be the next president, completely eliminating the original framers' reason for having the Electoral College in the first place. There could be reasons you want to do that, fine. We're coming up, we have a mail-in election, we have a media hungry to declare a winner, and then we also have electors and perhaps not being allowed to vote their conscience, even though most of the time they vote with the state's plurality anyways. That sort of trio of things happening is something that I have no idea what will happen. Gabe, I'd love to hear what you have to think because I don't know what's going to happen.
I do think, like you say, obviously with mail-in voting, because in some states the ballots can't start to be counted until after in-person voting, but we know that is changing in some states. Secretary trying to get that changed, and I think I believe you're right. That's the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, or something very arcane. That the electors meet. I do think we will see a result by then. I think we'll know kind of the results in most states by then. We won't know on November 3rd, and I think you're right. We're gonna have to be sure not to call a winner that night, but I do think by the time the Electoral College meets, we can be pretty sure that the votes will be counted and that that even mail-in ballots, that should give plenty of time, I think, for the electors to know who to vote for now, because like you say, for the most part, it is just voting based on the popular vote.
Thanks, Gabe.
So my question is about like government kind of overlap. Do you think that there is a lot of places that could be kind of more streamlined, and I mean try to like make it more understandable for people that are like regular citizens? Do you think that there are ways that the government could kind of change and evolve that would make it more suitable to today's world?
I guess I wonder, what do you mean when you say more suitable to today's world? Because certainly when we think government, we think red tape, we think bureaucracy, slow as molasses, redundancies, etc. But I will ask you, what do you see perhaps as the needs of today's world not being met by the current government?
Is the Supreme Court, they still aren't like airing their cases. Like, is that correct?
Well, I can speak to that in just a minute, but go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh, that's one of the things that I like think that a lot of the world has kind of pivoted to, and for like clear, like to show the kind of workings of the government.
Yeah,
that is one example.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is what's fascinating. People have been petitioning the Supreme Court. Members of the media, lawyers, et cetera, have been petitioning the Supreme Court for decades to have a broadcast of oral arguments during hearings. And the Supreme Court has always shut it down and said, no, the lawyers will grandstand. And also, who's really interested? And also, we base our decisions more on the briefs than we do the oral arguments. So there's no reason for this. Let's just limit it to those 50 people, about half of whom are just special guests who can go into the Supreme Court and listen to oral arguments. Then COVID hit, and a court that in many ways interiorly has really pledged its fealty to transparency is then left with this issue where no one could go and listen to oral arguments. So how does the media report on it in real time? What are you to the people if you are not accessible at all? And they agreed to air audio, not video, audio of, I think it's like 7 or 10 cases, and the turnout was 1.9 million people across the world listening to these live oral arguments. The lawyers didn't grandstand, and the media was able to produce of the moment news and information about these cases as they were being argued. And a lawyer I recently spoke to informed me that she got a letter. She had been petitioning the Supreme Court to broadcast. She got a letter from the clerk of the court saying, it's interesting. This kind of worked out. We're going to think about amending our policies and allowing for broadcast in the future, given COVID-19 or not. So I think these things happen. I think, interestingly, what I love about that instance is that it was sort of like an obstinance of the court, and all it took was an accident to show them that, in fact, what were we worried about anyway? And I think you see that at the government level. I used to cover the New Hampshire State House, and you would see procedural changes that made the State House more accessible to the public, often because a member of the public wrote a letter or a kid walked up to a senator and asked a question. So I think certainly there is resistance in government to changing in terms of transparency and ease of use, but I think that that's often a matter of habit, maybe a little bit of laziness and of not paying attention, but not really malintent. I hold out hope, at least, that there is, for the most part, a general compulsion to serve the people, and that when people ask and can sort of prove their point in one way or another, just ask for a shot, just be like, just try it this way, just once. And if it works, what could that hurt? I think that can happen. I really do believe that that government is, some people in government are listening.
And thanks to NPR, I actually know the myriad ways that C-SPAN changed the way that the legislature works. So.
Wow. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great story on NPR. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I know there is a lot of things that are probably racing through your mind. So, here's one from January. What do you think about allowing 16 and 17-year-olds voting?
Well, we can't have opinions, Shane. Just kidding. We can't have opinion. So we're working on an episode on the 26th Amendment and about the grand resistance that there was to making 18 the voting age, and it was like people were shocked at it. I will not say how I feel about it, foolishly, but I will say that I am. Just to your previous point, your question, Shane, which is how can we make these systems more transparent and a little less slow as molasses? What you do, and these are just people, right? These are people who are working in a machine, and it's messy, and it's supposed to be slow. Like if you go in there, if the Senate, for example, was elected every 2 years, just like the House of Representatives, you would have everybody, all 535 people, roaring into Congress and passing new stuff that's of the moment. And but now you have those, other people holding them back. The Senate, the people who've been there on the 6-year election, sort of saying, "Oh, we got to just sort of slow things down," and that's I think a really kind of cool process. It's slow by design. It's not supposed to react quickly to tons of laws being passed, because if you want to live in a country where everybody does things at the snap of a finger, that is a dictatorship. That's the one kind of government where everything can get done of the moment. But to kids coming in, how do you change things is you have young people come in, right? You look at the younger members of the House and the Senate now who know how to tweet better than you and I can, and they are the ones who are going to change these systems. And it's like any job. You go into a job, you have this Byzantine, this is just the way we've always done things, and one person figures out one new way, does one new computer programs. It gets everyone to use like Google Calendar or something like that. And the system changes. It's revolutionized overnight. I think the same is true for government, where if you get younger people involved to vote and to serve in those positions, you're going to see wonderful change that is more of the moment.
I would say also that, and then after this, I really want to hear what you have to say, Gabe. But, we might think of, this is often an argument against allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. By the way, you can often pre-register to vote, and I really encourage you to. If there are any 16 or 17-year-olds out there, please look into pre-registering to vote when you're 16 or 17, depending on your state. But I do think this notion that the youth are not engaged, they're not paying attention, so they're not going to vote smart, is kind of a fallacy because, we're not paying attention to them. We're not making the laws for them. And that's in part because they don't have access to the franchise. So I would say if I were to argue for a youth vote, I would say if you give people, perhaps the ability to exercise their voice, then they feel bought in. And they are that much more likely to actually pay attention to engage, to educate themselves. By the way, they are the closest to recent education, usually, in terms of a voter block. So I think that's just something to think about.
Yeah, I would say, I guess I won't take an opinion either, but I am someone who, I guess for most of my political consciousness, wasn't able to vote. And so, and I do think you make a really good point, Hannah, because we know from studies that like the earlier that someone starts voting, the more likely they are to vote for the rest of their life. So if you start voting at 18, it's like statistically way more likely that you'll be voting, year after year after year after year. So, and I think if we did start that, like you say, right when people are learning about civics and learning about the system, just the possibility that would have of just like hugely raising the voter turnout, I do think it's worth exploring. And I think it's also interesting to note, as we were talking about earlier, just with the system of federalism that we have in terms of each state running elections, is it wouldn't actually take a constitutional amendment. And actually, I believe San Francisco will be voting in November to lower the voting age for municipal elections to 16. And so I do think it'd be interesting if other cities, I think they're going to be voting about lowering the voting age. And so I think it's something worth at least for it to start in the city or state level for those elections, because cities can do that if they want to and kind of start lowering the voting age and seeing if it does lead to that kind of huge increase of engagement and turnout, then it could be something worth exploring.
I cannot wait to see the results like 4 years after, right? The case studies of
Yeah.
that 4 years after. Like, how did this affect the city? That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I think it'd be super interesting.
Gabe, now that you've moved to DC, are you going to be active in the getting electoral votes for DC?
I'm not going to be an elector or anything. Oh, you mean about trying to? Well, DC has 3 electoral votes.
Oh, okay.
That's the 23rd amendment.
Yeah.
Well done. Yeah, no, that's so no representation, but 3 electoral votes.
Nothing in Congress,
There we
but the same as the least amount of electoral votes that any other state has.
Is there taxation? Do you have taxation in DC without representation?
That's what the license plate says.
Oh.
And I'll say you can start getting income tax at 16 too. So
yeah, that's a good argument, Gabe.
That is a really, if you were to argue, that would be a good argument.
Go
that. So one last question. Of all the cabinet positions, which I think are kind of the most elusive positions in government, at least concept-wise, which one did you think that you knew the most about going in to writing the book that surprised you with the information that you were like finding from your research?
For me, I thought I understood how large and powerful the Department of Defense was, and I had no idea. I believe it's the largest public employer in the world, Nick?
Yeah, 2 million.
How many? No, more. Well, so more than that.
The executive branch has 2 million, but 2 million of them are in the Department of Defense, and 2 million of them are in every other branch is the executive, right?
It's more. It is more than that. I can look up the number. But anyway, the point is, so I don't think I would hear Secretary of Defense. If we even did an episode on Secretary of Defense, I knew what the secretary did. But when you take the department as a whole, it's really gobsmackingly massive, especially compared to every other, as Nick was saying, cabinet.
I think I was most interested in reading about the Department of Homeland Security just because it's so new. And you look at these other departments. So the fun mnemonic device for remembering all the departments, the cabinets in order, it used to be Saint Wapniackle, and that was the order. So state, treasury, war, agriculture, and so forth. But then now the new mnemonic is see that dog jump in a circle, leave her home to entertain educated veterans' homes. And once you memorize that, you got all the cabinets.
It's a breeze.
So homes is the last one, Homeland Security versus state, right? To see how far we've come in terms of how a cabinet is organized, how one of these agencies and what kind of work they do. That was really fascinating to me to see the new versus the old.
Teresa says the Department of Defense is the largest in the world.
Aha! It is though. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Teresa.
And January, who asked the question about allowing 16, 17-year-olds to vote, says, I'm a veteran that learned early to be civic-minded. Even on a ship underway, I cast my vote. So, yeah.
Thank you, January.
So, yeah. All right. Well, I want to first off tell everyone, and I'll put the banner back up. I want to tell everyone that the book is available for sale at left-bank.com. You can get a copy. It's a really just incredibly easy, accessible paperback. So you can buy a copy for yourself, for that uncle that likes to argue with you, so that you can actually have him argue back. So he can read this, and then you can have like full-on arguments and make him get even more heated than before. So that's available for sale. I also do want to. You can't really. So we got these incredible enamel pens from the Found. So these are available for sale. If you buy a copy of the book, you can leave a note in the comments saying that you want to buy one of these. They are $10. Vote. I also put in the comments, one of our employees has a print saying vote as if your life depends on it, with a lot of kind of inspirational things that is very important to kind of think about when you are yourself considering how you're going to be voting this year. And we, as a civic-minded bookstore, encourage everyone to make sure that you're registered to vote, make sure that your neighbors are registered to vote, participate in the government. So these are things that we support, and thank you all for also supporting those things and encouraging our customers and our viewers to also vote and be civic-minded. So,
Absolute pleasure.
Pleasure
This
is
was
all mine.
great.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Gabe.
yeah.
Thanks, Gabe.
Thank you, Left Bank. I love it's my favorite bookstore.
Yeah, thank you, Left Bank.
Thanks, Left Bank.
All right. Well, everyone have a good night, and we will see you next time on Left Bank Books Presents.
Bye.
Bye.